Hello and welcome to a special episode of Screening Minds, the place where we unpack Bollywood or even just general cinema, to be fair, through a psychosocial lens, because it's never just a movie, right? We bring this special episode to you because we're done with season one. We're not quite ready to go into season two because there's a lot of content that it requires. We're not quite ready there yet. We're keeping ourselves very busy. For anyone who's following me and my work on an individual level or with Muted Healing, you know that there's a lot of stuff happening. But in relation to this particular episode, you'll know that this is not particularly alien if you are following my work. You'll know that Muted Healing is doing various different workshops for Palestine and for freedom, for activism, etc. And I guess the main theme that recurs throughout all of these is not so much about delivering or giving aid on the ground, but more so how can we support people like you and I, people of privilege, people with privilege? How can we support us to join the cause for activism and for freedom together in a collective, decolonized way, and in a way that can still contribute something to the bigger picture? So, one such effort of doing so is this conversation with Professor Sunny Singh. We talk about things, her latest book, A Bollywood State of Mind. We talk about Amitabh Bachchan. We speak about Shah Rukh Khan. We speak about Bollywood in the 70s and 80s and how these figures have been, I suppose you could say, quite important in freedom fighting or activism, in what it means to be a citizen growing up watching these films and how that can impact us and our political resistances. We talk about art. And I have to say, it's a great conversation to listen to throughout because it does build you up to the big crescendo at the end, which I walked away with feeling very, very enlightened, impassioned, and I don't know. I like to do things in threes, as you already know. But I felt all of those things and more. It has certainly reignited and kept that flame alive without burning myself out for using art as activism. So give it a listen. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and hopefully I will see you very soon for season two of Screening Minds. But for now, enjoy. Please share it with a friend. Tell a friend to tell a friend, and most importantly, don't just listen. Put this podcast away. Listen and commit or make a pledge to doing something with your strengths, your talents, your art. Find your thing and use it as a loudspeaker for the people who need it the most.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Sunny Singh. Do you prefer a title? How would you prefer to be addressed, actually?
Professor thinks good. Generally, that's fine. If we're friends, so you could probably go with my name, but Professor thinks good.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So, one of the reasons why I thought of you to speak about is, aside from the conversation between yourself and Refaat, which we'll come on to in a little bit, is your book called A Bollywood State of Mind. Just the title in itself is so intriguing. Will you tell us a little bit about what that title essentially encapsulates?
Gosh, that's a title that encapsulates a lot of things, including my very wary approach to using the term Bollywood. I'm not happy with it, like many people. I rarely use it. In India, you need to use it. Neither do you need to use it anywhere else in the global south. But it's the shorthand for commercial Hindi cinema, mostly made in Bombay. So it's the one kind of shorthand that let's say the global north understands and recognizes. The book itself is quite a few things. It's a cultural history of modern India, told through movies and theater and performance, starting about 1850 to now. It's also I suppose, a political history because you can't separate culture and politics, or rather, I'm interested in the way those two go hand in hand. Um, it's also a little bit of thinking about what makes this cinema, commercial cinema in Hindi, or indeed, if we're looking at commercial cinemas via extension all through India, and what makes it unique. So it's a lot of those. Plus, of course, I think our movies are very much like our lives. So it's a lot of anecdotes as well. I think there's culture influences us and our lives and the way we think. And I think the easiest way for me to discuss that was to just think about how much the cinema has played a part in my life and in my family's life. So it's a little bit, it also has a kind of a memoir streak dating back to early 20th century and my grandparents before independence, and kind of trailing it to now.
Okay, this is quite interesting. And I don't know how, I mean, considering this is the first time we've met, I don't know how comfortable you'd be about me getting more candid and deeper about some of those questions.
Go ahead. If I don't feel comfortable, I'll say no, I'm not answering that. But
And I
other than that, we're fine.
and I absolutely love those boundaries. Thank you for modeling those because it's really important to my work as well as a positive psychology coach and in my trauma-informed work. I'm very big on people kind of expressing their own boundaries and being okay to express them. So, I mean, for me, Bollywood, you mentioned there about it being a memoir streak because it's a depiction of your life and your personal history as well. You mentioned your grandparents dating back to the earliest 20th century. Bollywood, I would say, only really became a huge part of my family's life from my generation and my parents. And on a personal level, it was the thing that helped me to mute the noises of the outside world of my society telling me of how I should be, my community, my Bangladeshi background, my Islamic background, my white British friends, etc. All of them telling me the versions I should be. Bollywood helped me to kind of mute all of those voices and just focus on the story that was being told in front of me. And that's a brand that is quite personal to my own business about muted healing, where you mute the noises so you can tune into your authentic self. It allowed me to live many different lives. Is there a story about why it means so much to you in your history on a personal level?
Well, I think mine is slightly different from yours. I think it's quite interesting to think about how both of us are in Britain. We are both minoritized in different ways. And first, due to our racial identity and ethnicity, and also religious backgrounds and so on. I'm a first generation migrant. So, that is an additional factor. But I think for me, this cinema was surrounded me because I was born and raised in India. So this was the most important, most popular form of cultural consumption. So it's quite interesting that you're saying about muting the noises, whereas for me, this was the soundtrack. This was all the noise of my life from day one.
Mm,
It was on the radio. It was the posters would line the streets. It would be in in magazines. People would be talking about it. It was just everywhere. So I find that quite an interesting way of thinking about the difference between our experiences of the cinema. But I think for me, what's always stayed is that before even I watched the movies, I knew the movies. And this is a really strange way to think about how we imbibe culture, how we kind of consume culture, and we're built into that culture as children. Even before I watched a film. So, for example, my absolute favorite song, I was about 3, and I came on the radio, and that was Love at the First, I think, first beat, first 5 seconds. And that's the Marodam from Hare Rama Hare Krishna. It's still an extraordinary number. I mean, it's sort of 50 plus years later. You hear it, and it's as fresh as it was. And I fell in love with that number. I was a toddler. And by default, because I knew who had performed it, I didn't know the difference between singing and all of that and playback singing. I knew that it was Zeenat Aman. I didn't know what she had done. I didn't know what it looked like on screen, but I had seen photographs of her, and she just looked like the person who she was. She was sort of relatively dark skinned. She was not particularly kind of sharp featured, pretty, the classically South Asian pretty. But more than that, she had an attitude. And I had a crush on her immediately. I was a toddler and I was like, that's who I want to be. I'd never
mm,
seen her on screen. So that's, I think, one part of how that happens. In a slightly more complex way, I heard the soundtrack and possibly memorized it, the entire soundtrack of Mughal Azam, which is a movie from 1960, well before I was born.
Mm.
Before I watched it in my teens, because that was how you did it. We had this LP with all the entire soundtrack. I think it was four separate, like, those big LP records. And it had this amazing fold out kind of jacket with all these movie stills. And I always go back to the fact that this was really important because I could hear the songs, I could hear the dialogue, I could hear all the soundtrack of the movie soundtrack with all the sound effects, but I had no idea what it looked like. All I had were these few photographs. So you fill that in. So in so many ways, for me, I'm a writer, I write fiction, and I think those initial moments of imagining what these things were like is where my imagination kicked off. I'm always fascinated, and I think there is a much wider conversation on how our minds develop. That when I saw the movies as a teenager and sometimes later, I was never disappointed. They were exactly like I imagined them to be, which is quite weird, or they superseded what I had imagined them to be. I mean, would have never imagined that feather scene from Mughal Azam, which is hugely sensual and erotic and kind of, disturbingly so in some ways, perhaps. Um, and yet it was there. It was sort of our minds have molded in that way culturally. So I think for me, that's my fascination. It's also helped me travel. So that's the other side of this book, A Bollywood State of Mind. Um, Very early on, I was about 10 when my family, for my dad's job, moved to Pakistan. And I realized that the movies were something that cut across borders. We would meet people from Soviet Union. We would meet people from various other, parts of the world. The Afghans who were often in the middle of a refugee crisis that had just kicked off after the invasion by Soviet Union. It was a very strange process that all these different people, often sometimes fighting big, huge battles against each other, still somehow knew the same movies and loved the same movies. So I think that's always stayed with me, and it stayed with me in multiple parts as I travel. This cinema opens doors. I've been at the top of the minaret of Al Azhar in Cairo, talking about Amitabh Bachchan, when, while the Azan for Friday was being called. I've been invited, like I've joined a iftar meal outside, sort of in the gardens of the Moroccan royal palace, because they were like, "Oh, everything is closed. Come on in." And they wanted to, you're from India. Let's talk movies. And here, have our, share our meal with us around this table in the middle of, middle of the garden. So it's just really, it's something that's really amazing for me that so many people
Mm.
kind of think of India. I think one of, in this sense, in this way of thinking about these movies.
I think there's a couple of things there that you said which has really got me it's a nice segue into the next part actually, because you said, from what I'm hearing, is that music came almost before the movies, whether it was the Dam Maro Dam, whether it was Mughal Azam. And then what I like there is that you said you filled it with your imagination. For me, it was the opposite, in that a lot of the movies came first, and then I carried those characters or those songs with me later on, and they almost became like imaginary friends or support systems during difficult times. And the beautiful thing that we have in common there is, I suppose, is that it helped to close borders. Otherwise, I, as a Bangladeshi Muslim, have no connection directly to India, at least in my generation anyway. My ancestors are a different story, but being a migrant, or rather I was born in Britain, so I don't have that connection to my history like perhaps a first generation migrant might do. Now, something that you said was about movies helping you to travel and helping you to close the borders. How, I mean, let's take Amitabh Bachchan, for example, is a worldwide name. All right, people who aren't Indian, people who have maybe watched one Bollywood movie in their life, probably have seen an Amitabh Bachchan movie, right? And this takes me on to that tweet that I saw discovered between yourself and Rafat, and um, it was after, just for context for the listeners, this tweet was sent to me by my brother after the horrible October the 7th massacre and then the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians, where Rafat had tweeted, Amar Akbar Anthony is a favorite of mine. What a beautiful movie. I wish one day I could write about Bollywood's impact on the Palestinian First Intifada. And Cooley was particularly a hit. And just for clarity there, I want to mention that these tweets were actually sent in 2021. So this was before October the 7th. Excuse me. And that really piqued an interest in me because my whole podcast is called Screening Minds. It's not just a movie. To try and get people to understand that this is way more than just 3 hours spent in front of the television screens. This is us adapting our hairstyles. This is us buying the sari that Madhuri Dixit wore in Hum Aapke Hair Con because that was the latest fashion. This is us trying to get six-pack abs like John Abraham, for example, because we're so inspired. Like, these people have an impact on our everyday lives. And you responded saying, I remember about when Israel closed the cinema that played Bollywood in West Bank. They understood its dangers, and I'd love to talk to you about it. And Rafat honored, responded by saying it would be my honor. His PhD supervisor was Indian. She was thrilled knowing the likes of Amitabh Bachchan and Amjad Khan had impacted us Palestinian stone throwers in the first Intifada, especially that her own PhD was on coolies. That inspired something so amazing in me, and I have only my imagination to go by. So I now call upon you to now please help me fill in some of that context where you can.
Yeah, so you know, it's quite strange because my mind still can't compute that we don't have Refaat. So it's a very strange process. But Refaat and I had I think we'd followed each other for a long time online. I knew of his work even before sort of Twitter and all these things, because I remember way back when, it must have been 2006, 2007, and there was this process, and I did a blog about how, being able to tell stories changes how we are seen. So when we can tell our own stories on our own terms, it changes what's going on. And I had linked to a few of the blogs from Gaza, and I said, when the world sees it, when we see it from their side, from their eyes, so to speak, the way we think of Gaza, think of Palestine will change. And of course, it was a few years later, I realized that the blogs I had linked to at that point were part of the circle, part of that huge capacity that Refaat was building and had built in the years until his assassination. And it's extraordinary what an impact he had. That tweet that you're talking about was actually when I was working on a Bollywood State of Mind. So we would kind of connect, and we would just sort of, we were colleagues for all intents and purposes, because we teach similar topics and similar subjects. And I had been talking about Amitabh Bachchan, and of course he pitched in. Thing is that there is this idea that before Israel was formed, Palestine was some kind of a wasteland. There is this myth that's been created, and it's a very clearly manufactured myth, that somehow the greening of the desert, which by the way is a form of ecocide, and a way of hiding the genocide that happened in 48 and the 60s and so on in the 60s, because the trees cover the decimated villages. And these are sort of trees that have been brought in from outside. They're not indigenous to the land. But beyond that, there's this sense that it's a very Orientalist, to quote Said logic, of the savages, the people who weren't civilized, the people who didn't have great culture. And yet, when we go back to before the Nakba, so we're going to the middle of the century, 1940s, already we have huge amounts of evidence that not only did Palestine have, and here I speak of Palestinians, Jewish, Christian, but Muslim, but from indigenous to that land, Palestinians had this extraordinary urban culture. And they had, more importantly, a deeply cinephilic culture. So they were film theaters. They were there. Unfortunately, most of them have been destroyed. If I remember correctly, it was it the theater? I think it was Jenin, which the Israelis during the first Intifada, the Israeli army not only destroys it, but fires a tank shell through the screen wall. If you want a metaphor, there you go. But that particular one is absolutely exquisite Art Deco design and architecture. So there is already this incredible culture, and I wanted Refaat to write about it. He never got a chance, and he never will. And that I will always regret, because we have lost an extraordinary way of thinking about the world that he would have been able to bring to us. But beyond that, I think what was interesting for me, I have been trying to put this volume together on the impact of Bollywood, although however I want to not use the name, not just on the politics within India, but outside India. I remember there have been constant things. I remember, what was it, 2009, 2010, when the Iranians were using these political posters that were riffing off of Jodha Akbar. And I remember during 2011, some of the accounts on Twitter would suddenly changing their profile pics to actors, so it was Sunil Shetty and so on, and Salman Khan, and often a lot of action stars. I've watched various, even back in Kargil, the Kargil War, you had just as many Pakistani soldiers with sort of, Bollywood stuff on them as you did, on this side of the border. And I think there's something we should unpack. When I work on stardom, we think about why film stars matter. And they matter because they embody aspirations. They matter to people. If you matter enough to people and the story you're telling enough to people, that's how you get to be a star. Now, when we think of movies, if you take that further, movies in some ways tell our stories like books do. But they also in some ways offer us possibilities and aspirations and ideas. And Indian cinema is particularly interesting that way because it has explicitly anti-colonial rules, right? It's founded on this idea that we have to tell our own stories in order to counter what the colonizer is telling us. And this is right before even the first film is made. This is we're talking 1907. And I think when you take that forward and that conversation and some of the other exchanges with Refaat, it was that understanding, and he recognized very clearly and was able to and articulated it very clearly how that anti-colonialism was built in. Now, Amitabh Bachchan is a very deeply problematic figure within movies and as a star. I know this because I've written a book about him. So it's kind of funny. I'm like, yeah, lots of considerations around it. But his screen persona, especially that screen persona of the 70s and the 80s, you know, when you think about Amar Prante, you think of Kuli, you think of Mukaddar Ka Sikandar, you think of Diwar, Sholay. It's a
Lavaris, Nasib, amazing
yeah.
examples.
So this is somebody who fights against injustice. I think that's the crux of it. Why does he matter? And I've had the same conversation about Amitabh Bachchan across about 35 countries. First thing people look at is, you know, because here, anywhere that people are oppressed and feel that they are being treated unjustly, any narrative, especially a narrative. And Cooley is exactly that incredible final end with the green from the shrine, with him sort of, you know, speaking out the kalma while he kind of is shot. I mean, that's a very powerful moment. And I think, you know, all of those, that matters. And I think it spoke to people at a time when they were. And I think in Refaat's case, you know, when he talks about Kudi, that persona spoke to people who were being terribly treated, who were facing acute injustice even back then. And it offered the possibility that you could stand up to the oppressor and offered the possibility that you could win. And Cooley also offered the possibility miraculously that you might survive because, you know, Manmohan Desai made him live. You're muted, but I'm going to take half a second to close my door, okay?
Hello, that's right. You're muted now. um, there's, I think what you've just said possibly describes my feeling of disillusionment with Bollywood recently. Um, I grew up in the 90s, but I watched a lot of the 70s, 80s films. I'm a big fan of Amitabh Bachchan's professional life, at least, anyways.
Yeah.
And uh, I think recently with the influx of films like Gadar or Fighter, which I've not seen, but I've seen enough reviews of
Yeah.
to exactly the cringe element of it because of I know the messages and the rhetoric. I know the types of people that have worked on. I mean, I was very disappointed by Fighter because Anil Kapoor, for example, with Deepika Padukone, Hrithik Roshan, even for you to have chosen movies like
Yeah.
this when you've also done really beautiful, wholesome movies that are about unity in the past really confuses me about politics. And I think this apathy and apoliticalness of this modern generation. And again, I'm making sweeping statements, and I know that this is not for everyone, but it does deeply concern me because the fact of the matter is a lot of people are now going into it's just a movie, it's just entertainment, but by buying into these things, you're perpetuating a message as well.
So there's a wonderful quote by Toni Morrison, and it's the exact wording has gone out of my mind right now. And I don't want to break our conversation and kind of look it up and stuff. But where she makes the point that all art is political. Every bit of art is political, right? Generally, when you get somebody say, it's only aesthetics, or it's just a story, those are people who are they are just as political, and that art is just as political. What they're trying to do is to retain the status quo and maintain the power structure that has been established and entrenched. So what we tend to do is what we consider political art is actually art that in some way challenges the status quo. challenges the powers that be, challenges, speaks truth to power, if you want to call it that way. What we forget is that establishment art is propaganda, but it's still political. So there is no need for us to own 1 billion cars and drive around in whatever, gas guzzling Ferraris, etc., as an aspirational value. But we do. There is no logical reason why, for example, if we're looking at Sex and the City, women must have a straight relationship and meet the one and live happily ever after. And that the one, I mean, forget about who they are, they're quite a bit of a dish rag, but really their main quality is that they're rich. They're white, powerful, and rich. That is a form of propaganda of the status quo. That is just as political as anything that challenges it. But we have been accustomed to treating one set as political and the other set as not. Now, I would go back and say Indian cinema, not just commercial Hindi cinema. Indian cinema has been made by so many people in so many regions, so many backgrounds, everything. And we're talking 110 plus years of cinema history, almost 120 years of cinema history. What tends to happen is that there's so many different people making movies, right? So I can think of deeply conservative, terribly regressively patriarchal, casteist tripe from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. We could go even further back. But we don't have a lot of that material, archival material, but we have evidence that, there was always this kind of back and forth. I was fortunate that I grew up in a relatively liberal familial space. So we didn't go and watch the religious films. We were not taken to watch the sort of terribly patriarchal kind of, the woman sacrifices and weeps at a drop of a sort of, a hat or a pallu. We didn't get to watch that stuff because that was seen as not something that was part of our value system. So we went and watched, and not just for Indian movies, we went and watched all kinds of movies, Soviet, French, Italian, lots of it in English, pretty much all for educational purposes. And we went and watched Indian films, Bollywood films, or Hindi cinema, which kind of fit that, let's say, the soft liberal 70s, 60s, the first people to join this market economy, nation building, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, from my, that, which is what my grandparents and parents' generations were doing. And I think today's cinema has a similar feel. There is a lot of really great stuff coming out. So some of it is small budget, but you also get and the big budget movies. So when you look at things like Bachchan, and look at things like Jawan and Donkey, or these are big mass market films, or Rocky and Rani, but they do have a political edge to them, right? Now, it doesn't mean to say things like the million Akshay Kumar movies, Akshay Kumar movies, and the movies you mentioned don't have a political edge. It's just that one set, the politics that they embody are different. One embodies or one represents an idea of not just India, but the world that is, let's say, more equitable, more inclusive. And the other one is very much about a supremacist establishment status quo way of thinking of the world. These are, I mean, and these are always going to go back and forth. I think our job as not just movie viewers, but as humans and citizens and people who are interested in the world and care about the world, is to have the critical mind or critical capacity to say, not good. I'm going to watch that, right? I always think about how, you know, when we go to, when I do the curation for the little ones in my family, my extended family, I do the curation for their books. So I buy books for the babies onwards. By the time they get to be about 10, they've been kind of, you know, trained into thinking critically. But I think I wouldn't give them David Williams. I've never bought a David Williams. Why would I? Right? I want those kids, and I do the same thing for my friends' kids and so on. It's like, I want the child to have access to a world that is varied and complex and nuanced and interesting, and not be afraid of people who are unlike them, first of all, but be excited and interested by that difference. And I want them to be able to say, we want a just world. We want a world where every child, not just the one with privileges, has access to books, has access to schools, can go to sleep without the sound of drones, can not be arrested and put in prison by an occupier because they're 8 years old and held a pebble in their hand, are not going to get killed while they sleep in their beds, because, you know, so that's that sense of justice and morality is taught to us, and stories teach us that. And movies are the biggest form of storytelling we have right now.
Couldn't agree more. I think it would actually break my heart if Shah Rukh Khan ever did a film that was politically not as balanced as we would like it to be yeah, neutral about the statement. But yeah, that's how I
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think Shah Rukh Khan walks that such fine line. And I said this earlier to a colleague of mine, a writer from India, and I said, you know, I'm a Hindu, and I said, you know, we have to stop putting the burden of speaking up and representing and making the right kinds of films and books and whatever else, any kind of culture, on people who are minoritized. The flaw is, if Shah Rukh Khan does a movie, or if he doesn't speak, or if he does, you know, etc., 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 that's a minoritized person at great risk. The burden should be the majorities, not the minoritized persons. It's our burden. It's our weight to carry. It's our fight. We're the ones who should be speaking up and saying, look, this is not good enough. This is not okay. This is unjust. Not sort of saying, why aren't, I don't know, Salman Khan and Shah Rukh Khan and, you know, otherwise minoritized people, whether it's on religion or on caste or on sexuality or on gender, why aren't they doing it?
And it is that message that I think I'm really trying to partake with across all of my contacts, whether it's students, colleagues, friends, family, that fighting oppression is a privilege to have actually, for the majority, and we should be able to take on that burden and ease that burden from the minority. And one of the concepts, so for context, I do semi-classical Bollywood dancing, and my teacher is one of those as well who has recently been going through this process of how to support the Palestinian fight for justice, and you know whether or not to use a social media platform, how to use it, and so on. And you can imagine, growing up in a Modi government of India, how that can be quite difficult for people to do so with the kind of company that they might keep, or just the people in their immediate environment. So we've come to a point where we're collaborating and we're going to be delivering a workshop on the song Azadi from Hila Mandi, because she found that quite inspiring. And I mean, the whole show itself is quite inspiring. It's about Azadi from within, it's about Azadi from colonizers, it's about Azadi for women, or for whatever form of Azadi that looked like for the individual characters. And the whole message there that I've been advocating for the last 7 months is that art is activism. It can be activism. It's everything that we've just spoken about, right? Political.
Yeah.
So in 2024, in what ways do you think Bollywood can represent Azadi or activism?
Gosh, there's so much of it. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting because, India's just come out of its elections. This mad exercise with nearly 1 billion people on the voter rolls makes me laugh that we're going to elections here in Britain. And it's like, oh, we have to do this, and it's a snap election. I'm like, try having a snap election for 1 billion people.
Right?
It's going to take at least 7 weeks
Yeah.
just because you cannot go to polls at the same time. And one of the things I found very interesting was there's that straight to camera monologue that Shah Rukh Khan does in Jawan, which is about holding elected officials to account and holding them accountable. And it was very interesting to see that clip circulate on social media, because that, in a sense, is how art works. That movie is a kind of a, yes, it's political, yes, it's a critique, yes, it's everything, but it's, at the end, it's an action movie, and it's not exactly the most serious film in the world. But the way that was then used was fascinating. There's a collective of dancers. I know because I saw it on the Kathak dancer AditiMangaldas' feed, which is a collective of dancers in India who are taking a stand, and they're organizing, kind of coordinating on how to talk about the genocide in Gaza. But also, in some ways, these are also people who've spoken up about other things, right? So, and I think this is really important. Right now, in a sense, when all of us have we choose where we sit in terms of what we consider home, what we feel most connected to, and how much we want to change this. For multiple reasons, and not in the least because I've spent so much of my life, I suppose, deliberately or conscientiously or consciously outside, and my links to India sort of diminish by every decade. I speak about India, but I don't feel the same thing about India that I did even 20 years ago. But I will talk about Britain because this is where I make my own. This is where I vote. So and yes, I will speak about the genocides in Gaza, but also in the Sudan, also in the Congo, and the many ways that these are kind of linked and connected, and they're part of a larger historical process. But I think each of us, when we produce art or consume art, we make decisions. There's a line in my novel from Hotel Arcadia that says, it's a character who's at in a 5-star hotel in a very posh place, and says, genocides are planned in a place like this. And I think this is where we need to think about, genocides may be implemented in places like the Sudan and the Congo and in Gaza and in Rwanda and Bosnia, and we can keep going, and Myanmar, but they are planned in very posh, beautiful, polite, spaces with dress codes and hushed voices and people speaking very well, people with massive degrees and, from the top universities in the world. And unless we can see that, unless we are able to draw those threads, we will constantly be playing catch up. And art is never about playing catch up. Art should be, and in this case, I'm talking about dissenting art rather than propagandist art. Dissenting art is about not maintaining what we have and what has been, but about changing what we have and then imagining what could be. So we can't play catch up. We have to start from going, this is what we need to change and figure out and create anything. If that's a little TikTok video, that works. If it's a short story, a poem, a banner, a meme, do it. That's how we change. That's how we create.
I have goosebumps. That last part was very it was incredibly beautiful. Actually, you know, when you were talking about that line in your book, genocides are planned in a place like this, it drew me back to, I used to watch Korean dramas. It's been a long while since I watched one, and there's this drama called Mr. Sunshine, and it was set during the Korean colonization or the Japanese colonization of Korea. And there was a hotel actually, which was the hub and formed many of the core scenes within that. And that was where all the major political decisions were made. That was the place to be. And it had everything that you mentioned there, the dress codes, the etiquettes, the speech codes, the language,
Yeah.
and it's you're right, it is that is not alien to any culture in the world. They all have those hotels and those hi-fi places, and those are pretty much
Yeah.
the common thread there is that capitalism or that colonialism, the supremacy values that are there.
Yeah, and it's always easy to then look out when you are in this artificially created space with these, I always laugh and, I had this conversation with my dad a couple of years ago. And and he said, we're not having lawns. And I said, okay, you must be the only person in the entire city who's decided not to have a lawn. He said, we can have a patch of grass, but lawns are colonial. And I went, Dad's been reading some of the books we keep leaving. So
Yeah,
obviously he's been going through the books that we've all left at home. And he's right. There is no lawns are a terribly wasteful thing to do. And if you walk around colonial spaces, walk around classist spaces, and you will see these vast expanses of green, which are impossibly expensive to maintain. I walk around this country and I look at it and I go, wait, we've got 1,200 food banks, but every space, every posh place has a lawn. Every public institution that is posh has a lawn rather than feeding your people. And I think that kind of devaluation of human life and the distinguishing of human life and differentiating of human life makes those polite spaces capable of not only planning, but enabling and carrying out genocides.
amazing. And I think I really want to repeat what you left me with. Actually, my takeaway is art is never about playing catch up. Dissenting art should be about changing what we have, imagining and reimagining what the future could look like. And what a beautiful way to entice us to make art, and to make intentional art, not just necessarily, the jumping on the trend that already exists in order to get more followers, but the intentional stuff that means something personal to yourself, and whatever struggle or whatever personal azadi is that you're trying to fight. Um,
I just
sorry.
want to circle back to something because we
Sure.
talked about, your practice and the idea of, healing and trauma and managing trauma. I mean, I think healing is an ongoing and constant and a very difficult, painful process, but just trying to, identify and contain and manage that trauma that we all live through. One of the things I've been watching is how the genocides are inflicting this mass trauma on the world, because it's all live stream. We're all watching it. And one of the things that happens is it makes us feel deeply powerless. And when you think of intentional art, that's one way of not feeling powerless. You know, if you're going to go meet some friends and make up a bunch of banners, funny and silly, for the next Saturday protest for Gaza, you're doing something meaningful. You're doing something constructive. You're imagining, you're using your powers, your creativity. You're using joy of hanging out with your friends, and whether it's making Refaat's kites or it's putting silly, slogans on it and making, memes and whatever, you're creating that sense of community and you're sharing that joy. The way we counter injustice is we center joy, we center that meaningfulness. So art, that you say, it's a very good way of placing it. The deliberate, conscientious, thoughtful art is always going to do that, because we need it. We all need it.
It's amazing you said that. In our last workshop in November, we did a dance workshop to Noor Khuda, and we actually did kites, wrote little messages of hope on them. And I think we share the same values in that healing can happen in a decolonized way by community. It is when we are alone, which is a very colonized way of thinking, you get through it by yourself, lone wolf, capitalism, 9 to 5, focus on yourself. We heal and are stronger in community, which is unfortunately the threat. Well, no, fortunately for us, unfortunately for the systems in power, that is a threat to them. So community is, I love that we counter injustice by centering joy. Professor Singh, I'm so happy that you've given us your time. I have one super last question to ask you, and then we'll wrap up this. And it is probably just a taste into your tastes of Bollywood. So, thinking about particular songs or films, what are some of your top examples of Bollywood art as activism, other
Uh,
than Amitabh Anthony, Cooley, Sholay, etc.?
well,
I know it's a hard one.
Amitabh Anthony is the perfect kind of partition trauma turned into this kind of imaginative, wishful thinking that the three countries can unite again. If you think about the heart of Amitabh Anthony, it's a deeply political film. If you look at Sholay, it's the same thing. It's that process, and there's all kinds of issues with Sholay, but there's a very strong political core there. For me, I think Machis remains one of my absolute top favorites. I think anything by Gurudat, Gulzar stays my favorite, not Gurudat. Gulzar stays is my favorite, one of my favorite filmmakers, political filmmakers, and also somebody who's explicitly so. He did a film back in the 70s called Mere Apne, and again, Mere Apne is now hopefully haven't. I think it is Gulzar. I've just got a brain freeze there. And it's about student activism and unemployment. So there's a constant push. I think Rocky and Ronnie does a really interesting job of questioning issues, not just of gender and sexuality and the ways we think of it, but also around regional prejudices and class prejudices. And does so in a kind of very, silly, light-handed way. But we forget that, that there's so much incredible cinema. Lipstick Under My Burqa, Lapata Ladies Now. I mean, there's just no end to amazing. Majama can you imagine?
I loved Majama.
But can you imagine a Hollywood actress like Julia Roberts or Meg Ryan, the sweetheart, doing a part like that, the way Madhuri pulled it off. I mean, it's extraordinary. So I think that's a constant process, and it's never just a movie. I think these are things that you kind of people take on board and it stays with them. Even when they don't think about it, even though they may not be conscious they've thought about it. And it's a good way to kind of change minds and opinions. And I've seen it having grown up in that kind of Amar Brantani logic of the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb, of the inclusivity of the, with all its faults. I've seen the radicalization and the move towards a Hindu supremacist cinema very deliberately. So I also know it can be switched back because that's beyond the politics and beyond the weapons and beyond all the structures. We also live in a constant battle for stories. Which stories, so the better stories, the stories that we tell which are better, that's the best reason. Stories that don't dehumanize, don't other, that don't promote injustice. When we can avoid those, then we all come out better. So no, it's never just a story.
What a beautiful note to end this on. Thank you for saying it's not just a movie, because that's literally the tagline of the whole podcast. And also a special mention to Rocky Yorani. That was actually when that movie came out, it inspired me so much. I spoke about it at a mental health conference for South Asians and South Asian therapists, and the impact that movies like that can have. And it's actually the very first episode of season 1. So, Professor Singh, I'd love it if you would give it a listen and let me know your thoughts. It's a very short episode, but I would obviously pass that on to you. And thank you again so much for your time.